This is Call the Psychiatrist, the show where psychiatrists answer your questions. I'm Dr. David Hanley.
And I'm Dr. Abby Snavely.
On this episode, we have 2 listener questions. Larissa was nervous during her first online therapy session and wants some tips on how to be prepared for the next session. An anonymous listener has a history of stalking their therapist and has the desire to repeat those behaviors with a new therapist.
Say you like me, you better count the...
Listening to this podcast does not mean we have a doctor-patient relationship. Our intention is to educate and entertain you. Nothing we say is intended or recommended as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your own physician or other qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical questions or conditions. This question comes from Larissa.
I signed up for therapy using the Betterhelp.com application. They suggested I spend some time thinking about the first session, advertising it as, quote, "this is where the magic begins," end quote. I went to my first online session and it was far from magical. To be honest, I was a nervous wreck. My mouth was so dry I could hardly get any words out, and my therapist, while fine, was definitely unable to help me get over my nerves. I'm wondering what kind of advice you have for the first session of therapy, or even the second or third. Should I come prepared with a list of topics to discuss so that I don't forget anything? Are there ways you suggest to calm yourself down so that it can be more magical? I definitely want help related to my career goals and what path to choose. And I am, for the most part, fairly competent. I was just so surprised at how my mouth became full of cotton candy the moment I joined online. I'm also wondering how you can tell if online or in person is the better approach.
Okay, so that slogan, "this is where the magic begins," I didn't know they were doing that.
That's a lot of promises. They're putting a lot of expectations on that first session. So it's hard for me to imagine how anybody would not be disappointed after that.
Well, it's completely opposite all the things we say on our show.
I know, right?
How it's so hard. And I was thinking there's no
Right.
therapist in that marketing department for sure.
No. I wish I was more surprised about that. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's part of it.
But imagine what an honest slogan would sound like. "This is where you'll cry for months and question everything about your life, but slowly over time
This
you'll
is
feel
where
better."
a long, tedious process begins, where you will feel worse until you feel better. And it's going to be really hard and probably expensive.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I guess we could do some editing for clarity, but I'm pretty sure that's where we're at.
Yeah, I don't equating it to a trip to Disney World. I think you're going to be disappointed.
Unless it's a magic show, I don't want to be promised magic at all. Maybe I'm too cynical, but I'm just going to be, I'm going to be skeptical and kind of cranky heading in anytime. Yeah.
So Larissa, I think they didn't set expectations correctly. And I just want to say, of course, it's normal to be nervous. I've had people sweat through a shirt and jacket the first couple of sessions. So I just want to normalize that. It's really hard. It's hard to come in and be vulnerable in that way. And did the video format add to that? I don't know. We can talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, it might be harder to open yourself up to a stranger you just met on a computer screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I agree that it is totally normal and very common for people to be nervous, even if they're prepared, even if they don't have the expectation of magic. I don't know if I've said that on this show before, but my first session with my most recent therapist, I abruptly stated that I had to go to the bathroom in the middle of it. And then I left. I went and I was going to leave. And then I realized I had left my purse in the room and I had to go back in. Okay. From your actual laughter, I can tell that you haven't heard that before, but that was just true.
I haven't heard that. Thank goodness for a hall bathroom. You'd have been crawling out the window or something, right?
I mean, right? But no, I had to go back in and get my purse, and then I decided to stay. Yeah, and then I cried for years, right? It wasn't. I mean, mostly I'm glad I didn't bring it, and I'm sure there was some. According to him, there were some unconscious things at work. But I'm just saying, it's hard, right?
It's hard.
I had been to therapy before. I was a psychiatrist. I mean, anything that was supposed to make it better didn't make it enough better for me. So there you go.
When I remember thinking I was going to be so prepared, I was going to give a clinical presentation of myself.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I made it maybe 5 minutes before I cried for 20 minutes. So.
Right.
I don't know. There's only so much preparation you can do, and then it's the experience.
Well, and we should, of course, we will conjecture about this therapist and what they were doing or not. But I can also guarantee that probably the therapist has seen this before, right? Or some version of it, and that they aren't going to be as alarmed.
Yeah, and I was curious, like, what the therapist did to put her at ease. Do you have any tips? Like, I mean,
it sounds like nothing.
Well,
right?
she said Larissa said that she tried to put, or her efforts didn't really help, but she tried to put her at ease. Yeah. Mm-hmm. When I think about this, when I think of a patient that's, anxious or maybe unable to talk in that first appointment or first few appointments, I just structure them up a little bit until they get more comfortable.
I was going to say, yeah.
Open-ended questions are hard when you're nervous. So I just get curious and then I back off. I mean, once they warm up and people find their voice but yeah, you put them at ease just by filling it in for them, just leading them a little bit. I mean, this is part of the whole, it is a bit of a dance, right? And it just means that I'm going to lead for a little bit if you need me to, and then I stop when you don't need me to.
Yeah, normalize it. Sometimes, if I can tell what they're reacting to. I mean, you're right. If it's just the whole scenario, then, like you said, just some structure, some questions. I might even just say, like, I know this is a lot. I know this is personal. Sometimes I might say, this is why I'm asking whatever I just asked. If it seems like a certain line of questioning is making them really uncomfortable, or moving away from it, knowing that we'll have time to fill it in later.
Yeah, calling it out and just saying, hey, it sounds like maybe we should avoid that topic right now. Why don't we shift over here and look over here for a second?
Yeah. We don't, or even just like, we don't have to do that today. It's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there are things like that. I will ask maybe if there's questions that they have about me or how I work, to try to take a little bit of the focus off of them. I mean, I am curious about that, and I'm going to maybe add in some version of that at the end of any starting session. But, especially if it just feels like they feel like they're in the hot seat, right? I mean, emphasizing that we're in a partnership.
Yeah. At the end, I always ask, was it harder than they thought? Was it easier? I try to get some discussion of the alliance and things. Like for Larissa, there would be a lot of discussion about how hard it was, and then maybe thinking about next time. Like we would have talked about that, next time, or there's some strategies we can try. But, I was wondering if there's something more that had Larissa choked up. I mean, this is just me speculating, but she says, she's there for a decision about her career. And I just wonder, she's wanting to keep it topical, but if she's worried that something else is going to come up, she says that she's fairly competent, which I don't doubt that for a second, but I'm wondering if she's actually doubting her competency. Does she think going to therapy means that she's less competent? Does she feel like an imposter? I don't know. Just her surprise at her reaction has me curious, and I may be completely wrong. It may just be that, it's hard to do. It's hard to do on a computer screen.
And it's new. Yeah. I mean, and I'm sure we've said some version of this before as well, but generally speaking, I think that someone reaching out to a psychiatrist or a therapist they're at some point, usually it's a pretty big deal, right? I mean, sometimes people will say, oh, I'm moving and I just need to continue my medication or whatever. But if somebody is starting for a new problem or a pressing problem, and they've gotten to the point where they think they need professional help to solve it, I think usually there's some intensity there, even if maybe someone like Larissa wasn't totally keyed into that, right? Or maybe was, I don't know, defensively maybe disavowing what a big deal it was that, both the decision, but maybe even, like you said, just the fact that she's seeking help.
So she asked about ways she can prepare. She asked, should she be making a list? I think it's fine if you want to jot down a few topics that you want to cover, and then just go ahead and present those right away at the beginning of the session. And that way the therapist at least has a sense of what's important to you. But it can be very general. You don't have to go into a lot of detail about it. Just say, I'm hoping that we can at least cover some of this. Is that going to make you feel less nervous? Maybe. I mean, again, I'm not sure what the therapist was doing, but if they at least know some lines of inquiry, maybe they can help draw you out a little bit around one of those and just get you talking.
Yeah. And obviously, the therapist needs to know details, the presenting problem, the details of Larissa's life. But I have to think that any therapist worth their salt is also going to be paying attention to the affect, meaning the expressed emotion, and kind of what gets that person going. And, the training I had, if it's a therapy relationship in particular, would also say that whatever comes to the person's mind is what's important, and that I'm interested not just in the content, but the process of how those thoughts come and how the person presents themselves. Obviously, I'm not going to tell someone they can't bring in a notepad, or, I'm not going to ask it, because I'm also not going to ask somebody to like free associate right away. But to me, there's also value in how the story comes out, but or in understanding that and seeing it. But it may be that if the story needs to come out in the form of a list, and there's definitely people that want to read lists to me or things that they've written out, and I'm not supposed to interrupt until they've read it all. And like, that's fine. I can work that way too. That doesn't mean I don't think there's meaning there, which may or may not get interpreted. But I guess I don't think that there's a right way to do it. But like you said, if it makes her feel better, I think that's fine.
Yeah, not a right way to do it. And I wouldn't be surprised if after a few sessions, she doesn't feel the need to do it anymore. Like she just has to get over this hurdle. She's got to get
100%.
warmed up, get her voice going, and it will be very different, I think, session 4, session 5.
Well, yeah, because I actually think that might be one of the biggest obstacles about doing it on a screen. On one hand, it can be less intense and less intimidating to have that distance. But at the same time, I think from a therapist standpoint, it is a little harder to make a person feel at ease, right? Like your presence is less likely to be comforting if your face is just a box on a screen. It's not the whole office. It's not the vibes. It's whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can be paradoxical sometimes in the sense that the distance might let me disclose more, might make me less anxious. But yeah, in the beginning, I don't know. It's more of a barrier in my mind.
Right. I think so.
Her question about the online versus virtual. We half of episode 20 we did on virtual therapy. I think we could just summarize it though.
Sure.
Because you and I think came up to a consensus, which is we like the flexibility of virtual therapy, but it's nice to have access to both. Specifically, it's really nice to be able to meet in person those first few times, even if you think you want to do virtual sessions, or there's just times in your treatment, like it might be nice to reconnect in person. So I would say that might be the top of the list. And then I think we said, but something is better than nothing if you don't have access to it. And I think for Larissa,
BetterHelp, right? Like there's not an option to meet in person, if I understand it correctly. Right.
When I think Larissa, my advice would be, give it some more time. But if it's hard to get comfortable, then think about looking in your area, for somebody that may offer a combination. You've had this experience, so finding somebody that might see you in person, at least for a few sessions. And then if your schedule dictates that you need the flexibility of virtual, then do that.
Yeah. But and I don't know, maybe it's worthwhile for whatever reason to give this online therapist a chance, but I think that in addition to making a person comfortable, I think for some people, it can be really important to also understand the kind of the professional boundaries of what somebody's doing. Are they in an office? Kind of what's happening? I know before online therapy was so common, and I don't think we covered it in the episode, there was all these guidelines about showing your camera to show around the room, to show that no one else is in the room with you, for example. All these things to kind of like, I guess, reinforce the professionalism and the confidentiality of it. And I don't know, I was talking to a friend in her 20s the other weekend, and she and her friends had all tried these online therapy groups, and the therapists would be driving and pretending they weren't driving and not communicating about it, or like putting in a Starbucks order. And it doesn't sound, well, I know, it's ludicrous. And it doesn't sound like, of course, that Larissa's therapist was doing any of that, or at least she didn't mention it. But at the same time, I think some of that getting comfortable, which we've touched on in various ways in this podcast, is about the person being consistent and professional. And I think sometimes they're doing something egregious, at which point I would say like none of that's acceptable. And then sometimes I think you just don't know, right? If it's harder to trust what they're doing or where they're being or what they're like. And so I think it's a barrier, even if it, like in theory, increases accessibility.
Yeah, it's been such a quick history of this. We went from there's no way this will work to, okay, maybe this does work. And there was some data showing that outcomes were the same. but you need to have all these guidelines. And then COVID hit, and then it's like everything went
Right.
out the window. And so now I think almost everybody offers both. But yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. Those old
No, it was like a
guidelines theme.
rotation when I was a resident to learn at the VA specifically how to do this.
Yeah, they were at the vanguard doing this for
Yeah.
for a lot of communities that were
Mhm.
more remote. Well, but
Yeah,
back then you also
absolutely.
the patient had to also come to a clinic and sit
Right.
and still get checked in as usual, sit in a room with a computer.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Right.
everything
If the
has
federal government was going to pay for it. And now it's just like, yeah, of course we'll do that. Why not?
yeah. Yeah.
Like, everybody does it. And then people are like, wait, what? You want me to come in? It's like, yes, I want to see you. I need to see you.
Rapid technological change breeds anxiety.
It does, especially in people like me who really tried to enter a low tech profession. And then suddenly I'm on the computer all day and I have a podcast. I don't know who I am anymore.
All right. Well, Larissa, I hope that's helpful. Let us know how it goes. Let's, if you don't mind, let us know what the outcome is. If you get more comfortable, if it becomes meaningful, or if you do something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good luck.
Dancing just you and me. Cha-cha-cha.
Let's share some feedback. This comes from Marcine, if she's in the United States. If she's outside the United States, that's a real butchering of that name.
I was going to see what you were going to come up with. No, not going to do that.
The title of the review was Authentic. Your show feels real to me. I love the intelligence, transparency, and care that are shining brightly through these episodes so far. What a gift to us to increase our psychological understanding. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Marcine, or whoever you are. That might be the nicest compliment I've ever received. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, the timing was great too. It came the morning after the last episode, which I'd probably been up very late getting that one out. So it was nice getting a little boost. I appreciate
You guys don't know how much this keeps us going. Thank you.
We're so pitiful.
Listen, it's a roller coaster speaking into the abyss. That's what I mean. This is even worse. This is worse than doing online therapy where you don't get any vibes. We don't even know who we're talking to.
Cha-cha-cha, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha.
This question came in from an anonymous listener. We will call them Riley, I guess, just in case we need to reference them. We also don't know the gender of the person, which may be important as we talk about some of the topics here.
I'm into it. I assumed the writer was a woman, but you're right. I think that there's interesting implications, but we'll get there.
When I was in therapy 10 years ago, I stalked my therapist. I figured out where he lived and kept hanging around his building. I even figured out which apartment he lived in and how to gain access to the building. This type of behavior was not normal for me, but I was so compelled to be near him. One day he caught me in the building near his apartment. It's impossible to describe the amount of shame that washed over me. It was overwhelming. He sized up the situation immediately, and instead of firing me as a client, he got me in to see him the next day. This was one of the most embarrassing days of my life. When we talked about what happened, I was able to finally open up about my deep, unfilled needs and how I was trying to fill them. The more we talked, my desire to stalk subsided, and it was not long before I felt almost no need to do this anymore. I'm in therapy again with a new therapist, mine retired, and I'm embarrassed to say I'm experiencing a similar desire to know everything there is to know about my therapist. This time, instead of physical proximity, I'm researching him on the internet and have learned some things I have no right to know. It's again deeply shaming. Why do I do this? I want to stop. I know the answer is to talk to my therapist, but it's so painful. I'm afraid that they'll terminate me. What psychological forces drive this type of stalker behavior? What can I do to finally put this type of behavior behind me? Please help. Okay, well, one place maybe to start is that, so she's afraid that he's going to terminate her. And we've gotten a lot of questions where the listener is ashamed to talk to their therapist about something. They have intense feelings of any kind.
For fear of termination, right? Like often.
Often for termination, or just that they can't approach these feelings of love or anger, or they were hurt and disappointed. And most of the time we say, well, a good enough therapist is going to handle the situation. They've got experience. These are not uncommon. And we tend to offer a lot of reassurance. I think this scenario is maybe a little different. And so I didn't want to put too much reassurance behind it because I don't have as much confidence about how the therapist will respond.
Right.
I don't think stalking is the right word, and we can talk more about that. But, I think we can talk about maybe how we would respond or some of our experiences in these kinds of situations, but individual results are gonna vary.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's way too many variables to know for sure. I think it sounds like Riley had a pretty Again, maybe not unique, but a remarkable therapist before who was able to see this and work with it. But, depending on how far she goes with this behavior, you're right, she may or may not get terminated. So I think we can validate the wish and the desire that is totally acceptable and fair game and probably where it's at in terms of understanding herself and her drives. But I think it's in the action where things start to break down.
Yeah, again, just to underscore that, the craving for this closeness, common, happens a
Right.
lot. Not a problem. But yeah, it can't be acted on. And that's actually the reason that we talk so much about having good boundaries, because that actually allows you to talk about this and keep it as fantasy. You can interpret it, you can explore it, and that ultimately benefits the person seeking help. And she is a great example of that, because that's exactly what happened 10 years ago.
Right.
She talked about the fantasy, allowed her to manage it. And just a callback to episode 5, we talked about the erotic transference. It was somebody who was having some sexual fantasies about the therapist. And it's the same principle, the desire. It's just that in this case, the person is attempting to thwart the boundaries that the therapist has set.
Well, and to make something concrete, right? To bring something into reality, to actualize something that is in her mental life. And I actually think we should talk more about, what constitutes stalking or what the different boundaries are. But I do think that there's a point at which, probably for every therapist, you're not going to be able to work with it, right? If it's mental or if there's enough space, then you can work with it. But like if it's sort of, I don't know, maybe that's a bad analogy, but it's sort of like the dog that catches the car. Like, then what? I mean, I'm actually interested in this story about her going to the previous therapist's apartment building and getting in there. Like, what was the fantasy? Had she not been caught? Did she want to be in his house? Did she want to be in his bed? Did she want to know about his wife or his family? Again, these are all generalizations, but I think it was actually getting stopped before it went too far, whatever that means, that needed to happen so that they could work on it.
Do you think she put herself in a position to be caught? I mean, she was surprised, I guess.
I think it's very likely, either subconsciously or unconsciously, that, it sounds like it was mortifying, but at the same time, if she also had an internal sense of, I don't know where this ends and it's not actually going to work, if it was too hard to bring up, and then, basically getting caught brings it up, right? Like, I mean, that's a way. There it is. It showed up. And if that was a way to get to talk about it, then I'm glad, but I'm hoping that she can find a way to talk to her current therapist about this earlier in the process.
Yeah, I want to go back, as you said. We don't. I wish we knew more about what her intention was with that prior therapist, because the intention is really what would define stalking. Because on the
good point,
on the surface, I don't. It's like this isn't really stalking. It doesn't meet. I don't think it would meet the legal definition, but we don't actually know. How far her fantasy would have taken her.
Right.
And as you were saying, so I don't know. I guess initially I had dismissed it as like, well, this isn't really stalking. This is a desire. She went a little too far. But yeah, you're right. We don't have enough information. In the same way, when I think about how the current therapist would respond, when you say, oh, I Google searched you or I did some online searching, you're like, oh, okay, that's not much. But when you add the history that I've done this in the past, I think that's when the risk assessment or the maybe the perception of the therapist is going to change. And that's where I'm not sure how it's going to be read.
Well, and that at least in how that the story from the past is told, she needed an external event to stop her.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I think about stalkers who are looking for intimacy, normally, I mean, those are folks that have delusions. I mean, they tend to be pretty ill. I mean, they think that the target will love them back, and I wasn't hearing any
with
of
like
that
a celebrity or something is what I think of, right?
For her though, it's so ego dystonic. I mean, it's just not her self-image. I mean, again, she talks about the shame. She's talking about the shame even of the online behavior,
right?
So that's why I don't know.
Which that I could kind of normalize. I'm not I'm not going to lie.
These days, yeah, especially.
Well, yeah, no. Well, when you say these days, even I guess this was a long time ago, but 15 plus years ago, when I was in training, some of the older generation of psychiatrists would say that if someone has Googled you or looked up anything online about you, that was a sign of a personality disorder or borderline personality, someone who had obviously flouted the boundaries, right? And I don't really think that's true. I think it is normal. I think we all, to greater or lesser extent, but it's very common to Google people that you might have a relationship with, right? Like dating or work or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of, for better and worse, there's a lot of online information about each and every one of us that is discoverable. And so, I don't know if she did anything illegal or not even illegal, like extra digging, but, most people have some kind of online presence that is going to show up.
Yeah. She only characterized it as things I don't have a right to know. And I thought, well, I mean, there's a lot out there, though. I mean, she could know, I don't know, about his home, about his voting record, about. But then,
where he lives. Like, I mean, that obviously you can do that. That's, she did it before. And
or is it a next level where she's gotten into like Facebook groups where he might be, or you're trying to maybe get more personal information?
And I know stories about patients finding information about the therapist's spouse because of their social media presence or something else. And I think that probably does cross the line more, right? Getting into that person's personal life. But again, I don't, it's hard to know like how far is too far. But I don't think that, looking things up categorically is a problem.
You brought up age, older attendings and things. And I actually thought of age as being one of the biggest variables about how the therapist is going to respond. In my mind, I was imagining, because the other therapist retired, that he was likely older, probably had more experience. And it made me think that the way I would respond today would be different than the way I would have responded 20 years ago. And I think some of that is because I think a lot of times it takes more experience to get comfortable with the kind of desire people have. I mean, I think when you're young, you're working to try to make a good bond with somebody, and it can be very surprising when a patient feels very intensely about you, or they become preoccupied with you. I don't know. I think it can catch you off guard. It's until you experience it. I remember a case when I was in training, and it was really my supervisor that had to spell it out for me, like what was going on with the patient. And I felt so young and inexperienced. It was kind of like the, likes me,
Right.
And I was thinking about, until then, I had been working with such ill people where it's really easy to know where you stand with them, because they're catcalling you or propositioning you or whatever, or they're going to kill you or whatever. But I don't know. So I don't know. I was just imagining that the older guy, who I imagine was older, just probably had dealt with it more. And if the new therapist happens to be less experienced, I think could be more overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's an interesting idea. I've had some patients who maybe have found things out purposefully, but sometimes people really want to hold that boundary, which is the other side of that coin, right? I ran into somebody at a restaurant, and then they were never going to go there again because of the horrific chance of seeing me. That some people get really kind of hyper conscious about keeping those boundaries, but I think most people are somewhere in between, and Riley is farther along that spectrum.
And then we've brought up gender a couple of times. I do think that's an interesting part of this. I know there's the people that are more who have expertise in stalking say that there's probably as many female stalkers as males, but that the females don't get reported as often, especially if their target is a male.
Well, statistically, we're not as dangerous, right? I mean, like, that's probably perceptually, but also, it might be creepy or weird, but I think it is that women are less likely to be violent than men.
Well, and then there's I think the men are often maybe embarrassed or feel like they can handle it, like that they don't need to report it either. I think it maybe goes, I think there's a bias in both directions.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. And I'm glad you're thinking about it. I mean, I remember when I was opening my practice telling some of my classmates in my cohort that, I was opening an office with a friend, and They were like, oh, why don't you just do it on your own? And I kind of said, I don't want to meet. I mean, this is a little different from stalking, but I don't want to meet random people if I'm all alone and the patient knows I'm all alone, right? Like sometimes it's very helpful to have someone in the office. And I don't know, maybe they're actually really good guys. I don't think they're particularly clueless, but they're like, oh, I never thought of that. And it's like, right. I mean, the safety considerations are just different.
What's been your experience with somebody wanting more closeness than is possible?
I think it is tough because I think I do understand, or I can understand how painful that longing is. And that maybe it sounds like a cliche, if somebody asks you a personal question and then I try to figure out what's behind it. There are things that I'm happy to answer. A more standard approach might be like, well, let's see if we can figure out why that's important to you. And if it still is at the end, at the end of our discussion, I'm happy to answer if in fact I'm happy to answer. I think there is kind of a real exquisite pain of that. But I also think that there is something that I really do fundamentally believe that, how should I say, that knowing all of my biographical details doesn't actually achieve the closeness that the person wants, if that's what they're looking for. And I think that pain is something that I try to hold really tenderly and have a lot of empathy for. And the frustration of not getting more of me or not getting enough of me. If a patient disclosed this kind of longing to me and this is a generalization, but they were meeting with me once a week, that might be an indication that we need to increase the frequency or something like that. And so I think we deal with that I try to deal with that in a really like human and connected way. And, without just saying like, you're never going to get it. This isn't what's going to happen. But I think that we end up with that pain of not full closeness and not full understanding, like kind of no matter how else we get there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think even on the show, you've talked about, or maybe we've talked about people needing to call a voicemail and listening to a voice. And I've had people talk about driving by the office.
Sure.
Just, again, to kind of appease some of that fantasy. And you're right. It's like, it can never be, can't really satiate it. It's never going to be requited.
And I mean, I think we've talked about that some as well, that that maybe we can feel it or we can understand, sometimes people might say kind of both admitting to the wish, but also the boundary, I guess is more common to me, where it's like, oh, in a different life, we would have been friends and we would have had a really good time together. Right. There's a bittersweetness in the fact that we're getting close in this way, but there's real limits to it. And then I, it's not like I always say that right away, but I think the answer to that is what we're saying is that there is still a different but deeper closeness that happens within the boundaries. I mean, this is all assuming that the primary need that Riley has is closeness, which I think is probably top on my list of theories for that. And I guess I'm talking about it too, because that is the version of this that I experience most. But, we can also talk about other potential drives behind that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think there are some that are maybe less tender, less love, less connection oriented. I think sometimes there can be almost a sadism or a control, especially if that person wants to know, more, or like I said, know something about somebody's spouse, to be invasive in a way that the therapist hasn't necessarily given permission for. I think sometimes maybe, and this is backing off of that a little bit, sometimes people are just really uncomfortable with the one-sided nature of at least the information in the therapy. And like, as you named, there is this kind of compulsive piece to it. But I also wonder if there is a test in this for Riley, if that's part of what's not resolved. My fantasy is maybe that the therapist that she worked with before retired before they could work through this. And, she maybe now has a belief that the person that she's going to work with, that's going to do good work with her, has to kind of tolerate a lot. And maybe she's really going to push until she finds that boundary, which, maybe lends itself to that idea that she wanted to be caught, or she was ambivalent about being caught. But that there may be some test in this of, I don't know, what the therapist can handle, or loyalty, or what she can get away with. I don't know. And I think some people get excited about being transgressive, right? And breaking the rules. And some of this, she's been through this and she knows that she's getting really close to crossing a line if she hasn't already. But if somebody's kind of aware of these are the rules and I'm not going to do them, I think that also deserves to be looked at.
So if she discloses this and he absolves her, then he's passed the test. Like
perhaps. Yeah. And then he's just as good as the retired one.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we talked about, I guess, like maybe a little bit of where our boundaries would be. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have ideas about that. I don't know how likely it is. I mean, I think it sounds great. And I'm glad that last therapist was able to work with her, but I don't know that that's a given expectation. I don't know that all people would have a capacity to deal with that for a whole variety of factors.
It's funny because in my fantasy about it, again, I really characterized it as such an old guy that just was completely
unfazed.
Yeah,
he's seen it all.
I saw it coming even without knowing.
I mean, right? If he's an old guy and he's a stereotype, he thinks all these young women are just in love with him anyway. So, I mean, no big deal. It's just another Tuesday.
What's so individual about how you assess just threats in general, like the world at large? I mean, is it more dangerous? Is it less? Are you safe? I don't, there's so much variability on the therapist side, which I think you were just saying.
I mean, I remember I was on a rotation at like a mental health center, and I ended up calling security on one of the patients who came in. And I legitimately felt scared and thought I had a pretty high tolerance and a high capacity. But my supervisor thought that I overreacted, which I'm still not sure is totally fair because she wasn't in there. And she said it's because I was pregnant. And she's probably right. I probably had some heightened state of self-protection at that time. I don't know if that's the only reason why. I'm not sure, how to characterize that, but I don't know. It stuck with me. It's one of the only times I feel like I had to call in outside help. So maybe there's something to it. But I don't work in mental health centers either. I don't know.
That's hard to be told though that you're overreacting when I don't know.
Oh, it wasn't great supervision. Like I wasn't right. I mean, I wasn't into it. That wasn't what I was going for. But I'm sure there was some protection there, but it's also like, is it not okay to feel more vulnerable? If you have a child inside you, it seems okay.
Yeah. Or if you were just a victim of a mugging a couple of weeks ago, you're going to have a different read on this situation.
100%.
Yes.
Or not even a couple of weeks ago, a long time ago.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, and maybe this doesn't, I'm always worried about taking us too far afield. But I also remember kind of when I was still a resident, but thinking that one of my co-residents was like a little too sensitive or got a little too freaked out or terminated a patient or something when I wouldn't have. And my big lesson from that, which I really do think I learned with a lot of supervision, is that people do have different capacities and that's okay. Because the other part is, we can, I guess from the therapist side is, all right, like, are you in danger? Whatever. I mean, yes, you have to figure that out. Like I definitely can't work if I feel physically unsafe. But if someone really thinks that the patient is a threat, I think that is a tough situation to hold a therapeutic stance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you got to talk about it before the therapist is scared of you. And most therapists shouldn't be scared of just talking, but that's what I mean when the actions sort of get away from a person.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you just really highlighted why she has to talk about it now before it goes any further, because then there won't be any way to establish enough trust. Because you can say, well, this happened in the past, I don't want it to happen now. Well, then there has to be enough of a, that I believe you if I ask you, or, have you been doing any of this, or have you been, looking more, or have you been trying to find me outside the office? But I did wonder, she was concerned about how to bring it up again or what to do. Mm-hmm. I would say go ahead and offer some insight that you've learned about this. I mean, say that I have these needs. Pick it up here. Yeah, I've talked about them with my last therapist, and here's an example. I'm kind of doing it again. Like I'm started. I even looked you up online, and I know it's related to that, and so I just want to get it out in the open now. I think that will be. I
want to understand this, right? Like I don't want to get carried away, and I think, who knows? But my hunch is I would be able to hear that from someone. Like
I think I would too. We don't know how long they've been working together.
I know.
It goes back to what we don't know.
Right.
And I don't want to come across as being like, well, I would handle it great. But if we've been working for a while.
I mean, who knows? But that sounds like a reasonable thing to say, or even at the beginning. I mean, I guess stalking sounds scary, right? But, some version of like, this is what I've been through and I had this intense need. And I think it's super important for me to understand. Like, again, I'll talk about anything. I'll talk, like, no desire is going to be a problem. The actions are almost always inevitably the problem.
Right. Well, especially because this is so one-sided, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, I have a fantasy that we will get a hotel room together. And so it's easy on the therapist side to say, no, that will never happen.
Right.
But we can talk about the fantasy. Of course we can talk about it. Like that's why you're here.
That's a good point. But that's why I'm like, is there some sort of sadistic or control or something there where it's so one-sided? And another question, in addition to will I get fired, that I think Riley can ask herself is, what might she be giving up by disclosing this? Is she giving up a secret? Is she giving up control? Is she giving up whatever that means to know something about the therapist that he doesn't know she knows, right?
Or does it give up on the...
Is there a sacrifice? Yeah.
Or does it give up the opportunity to keep moving forward with
right. If it's really about some sort of end goal, right? I mean... I think that is, that's where it's at.
Yeah.
Riley, it comes through that you are in a lot of pain. And I think that there is at least a really strong part of you that doesn't want to repeat that. And so I think talking about it and helping your therapist appeal to that side is going to be the thing that really moves you forward and hopefully sets you free of what sounds like a really uncomfortable compulsion you're having right now.
All right. Well, I hope that's helpful. Thank you all for listening. And a special thanks to our anonymous listener and Larissa for the questions. As always, we need your feedback. We need you to write your thoughts on the app you're using to listen to us. Send us an email or leave an audio message at our website, callthepsychiatrist.com. You can also just email us directly at callthepsychiatrist@gmail.com. And the DMs are open on Instagram and Facebook at Call the Psychiatrist. And most importantly, tell somebody about the show. Help us grow the show. Take care.
Bye.